Can you speak a bit more on how, policies in the US, are reflected in the UK and vice versa from, the political establishment and from kind of the populist as well? I mean, some say the Brexit movement was a precursor to Trump being elected. You, again, are in this weirdly unique place where you've got a foot kind of on each side and been able to kind of observe both. How do you see that as overall? And then how do you see that kind of moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's I'll speak about the policy element just first, because I find that to be very, very interesting. The populist one, which I'll come to second, is very, very similar in many ways. The policy element, the policy discussion between the two countries is very, very interesting as an observer, because you do just find conversations in the US which just really aren't on the agenda in the UK. And there's both positives and negatives to that. The positive element is that I would say the US, for example, you come over here and you realize I'll talk about the EU, you realize just how stifling the European regulatory environment has been to British business. And you realize that the golden egg, which has been gifted to us through Brexit, is just bigger than you ever realized. Because as soon as you look at the regulatory environment in the US and you see what can be achieved with a low regulation society, you realize that actually the UK has been really hampered by its association with the Franco-German statist model of regulation. And that model of regulation has been rolled out and has been slow creep and has been, Thatcher talked about it in her later years. George Bridges, who was, one of the Conservative Party kind of main strategists, he talked about it. It's one of the reasons he came out in favor of the Leave argument, because he said, I don't know what my research staff are doing 70% of the time because they're doing work from Brussels. I saw it in my own business. I've seen it in the corporate world in London. And as a result, you've seen this slow creep of EU regulation. In the US, you just don't have that. And it's so refreshing to come over here and find this world where opportunity is rife. And, you drive through middle America and it's like people starting businesses. If there's an opportunity, they move quickly to take advantage of it. And it's just wonderful. There's such an entrepreneurial go-get-em spirit over here. And I love that. So that is one of the major kind of policy differences in the US, where I'm just like, that is a real boon to the American psyche. I think on the other side of the coin, then you've got the policy debates over here, because they are so divisive, that there isn't much middle ground to be had. And that is something where you do kind of, it concerns me, because sometimes you do need this sort of, you need both parties to work together. I mean, you did see it in somewhere like criminal justice reform. So criminal justice reform attracted both sides of the aisle and things got done. In the UK, there is a sense of, occasionally there's coming together, a bipartisanship where actually good pieces of legislation can be passed. In the US, as the debate becomes more and more divisive, and as Congress has now been lost to the Democrats, but the Senate is still with the Republicans, there's less and less which can be achieved. So you do sort of feel almost like there's a policy stalemate going on. And that can be concerning, because, of course, there does need to be legislation passed. There needs to, even if you're rolling back the frontiers of the state, even if you're deregulating, that still needs to be passed. So, there is a slightly more divisive system of government over here, which encourages people almost not to work together, because if they think they're going to win the next election, they'll just wait until after that election. So that is a negative, I would say. But in terms of kind of unique policies, which I find interesting to look at from both the UK and the US perspective. I mean, in the UK, for example, we just don't have the same debate around, for example, vaccinations, which I find very interesting. I don't have any stake in the game. I've never really been that interested in the debate, if I'm honest. And so it's just been fascinating to kind of watch and learn about what the difference is between the British style of medicine and the American style of medicine. That also plays into a larger healthcare debate. The US healthcare system is very, very different to the UK one. And there are very many good things about it. And there are, there are a few bad things about it, and we actually do quite a lot of work with a great lady who runs consumer rights advocates, I think it is, or patients' rights advocates, who advocate on behalf of patients against the kind of cartel of the medical insurers. And that's been a fascinating thing to get involved in. So the policy areas are very different. We don't have the same debate around vaccines. We don't have the same debate about abortion. We don't have the same debate around gun control. And all three of those points, when you actually come to the US, you start learning about them. They're very, very nuanced debates. They're nowhere near as simple as they're painted out to be in the media. And as a result, for example, like gun control, I mean, it's ironic that debate will basically die because of these riots. And, you've seen weapons sales surge, you've seen ammunition sales surge, and all because of some riots which broke out. So suddenly people are concerned. And then, of course, the liberals have overplayed their hand on this one as well. Defund the police. Well, okay, so if we defund the police, who's going to protect us? Your rights of protection will fall back on yourself. So again, it's like a highly nuanced debate. It's not just a simple like, oh, well, everyone in America has an AR-15. That's a nonsense. It's actually about the rights to defend oneself. And so I actually do think that debate could have far more of a nuanced angle taken on it by the international media, which has generally just portrayed it as, rednecks want their guns, which is just an absurd argument. Yeah. And then from the populist side of the argument, I mean, just quickly on that one, there is a lot of similarity about that. And I would say that, the UK and the US have both bought into that kind of populist wave, which has swept a lot of the Western world. And actually, the comparisons between Brexit and Trump, and then of course you saw similar. You're still seeing populist revolutions across most of Europe. You saw one in Brazil. It's that debate is part of a much wider movement, and I think the US is a key element to that, but I don't think it's a unique element to that. So Britain did lead the way in many ways, and I think that kind of that Brexit argument was so powerful, and it did show a lot of people that it can be done. And then the rest of the world has kind of followed, and it gives me some pride, in being a Brit, that I think we led the world on that one. And I think there's a handful of people in the UK who changed the debate to an extent where we actually changed the course of world history, and that's an enormously proud. It gives me a lot of pride to say that.
Was that difficult for you, because you must have gotten a lot of heat pushing that agenda over here?
Yeah. I mean, again, I often feel sorry for the moderates rather than the people who are really in the fire. With people like Nigel, or with people like myself, or other strong levers, our flag was pinned to that mast from a very early step, and as a result, we're like Marmite. You either kind of love us or you hate us, and as a result, if you don't like Marmite, you're not going to put it on your bread every morning. It's that. As a result, I did get heat. I had friends who don't really speak to me much anymore, because of Brexit. I have other people, even in family, who don't really speak to me because of Brexit. But it doesn't really bother me, because it's just like, well, if our whole relationship was predicated upon my opinion about one political issue, then why were we friends in the first place? That's your decision. I've never ended a friendship because of it. But yeah, you receive heat. The moderates, however, the people who are the swing voters, who actually, I know a lot of friends and family who were those moderates, who were those people who took persuading, who wanted to hear the arguments from both sides. And when they decided to come down on the vote leave side, the backlash from members of their own family and friend group was far worse than it was for someone like myself, who, as I say, who had their colors pinned to the mast from a very early stage. They received so much heat, still to this day receive so much heat. And that makes me sad for them, because they got into a debate. They never thought this would be the outcome. They just thought they were voting on a particular issue to do with sovereignty and the future of Britain. It turned out to be something completely different, and now friends won't speak to them. That's something that shouldn't have to happen, but that's where that debate took Britain.